For the briefest moment in the 1990s, Britpop ruled the airwaves. Suede sighed out a romantically ambiguous soundtrack for elegant wastrels. Blur and Oasis were vying for number one, and everybody wanted to live like common people. It was music that delighted in Britain's pop history, taking the best bits of the Kinks, Jam, and Smiths, and reshaping them into anthems. The country's most important guitar-based movement since punk. But at the same time, many of those that weren't lifted by the rising tide of retroism found it tiresome, unoriginal, and encroaching on jingoism. But how did Britpop happen? What were the influences, the vital steps along the way? And how did we get to the point where indie became pop? These are the 8 songs to blame for Britpop. The key concept of Britpop, British songs that ruminate on British ideas and themes, is as old as British pop. But as Britain began to excel in rock and roll, no one was doing it better than the Kinks. Contemporaries of the Beatles, Rolling Stones and Who, it was 1964's You Really Got Me that put them on the map. A proto-metal thrust that topped the UK charts and went top 10 stateside. Oh yeah, you really got me now. You got me so I can't see my mind. After their debut US tour in the summer of 1965, they were banned from the country for 4 years due to visa issues. And so for the rest of the 60s, they could never hope to achieve the same international success as their peers. At the same time, their music became increasingly British in flavour. Singer Ray Davies, creating pop-sized, detail-rich social commentaries about British life with resolutely British characters. The posh egotist of a well-respected man. 'Cause he's better than the rest, and his own sweat smells the best. The deluded Carnaby Street mod clothes horse of a dedicated follower of fashion. Pursuing all the latest fads and trends. And the upper classes terrified of taxation, of Sunny Afternoon. The taxman's taken all my dough. It wasn't just the Kinks' themes that shifted. Musically, they started looking back at Britain's pre-war past to augment their pop. Musical vaudeville and the cheek of George Formby.
I'm leaning on the lamppost at the corner of the street in case a certain little lady comes by. His clothes are loud, but never square.
And while the Beatles' harmonies tried their best to replicate a collision of the American brothers Isley and Everly, Davis let his South London burr eke out. Simply, they sounded British. The Kinks' apex of British pop was May 1967's Waterloo Sunset. Originally written as Liverpool Sunset as a eulogy for the now over Merseybeat movement, it was changed after the Beatles released Penny Lane, a similarly nostalgic celebration of their hometown.
Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes.
In the end, it became an almost metatextual exploration of Davis himself, the narrator viewing people coming and going outside his window, commenting on them out living their lives as he sits lazy and friendless.
Every day I look at the world from my window.
He gifts the grimy Thames-facing Waterloo a warm romantic glow, helped by his memories of the place.
Waterloo sunset, I am in paradise.
Waterloo is a part of London that has always had a lot of significance for me. When I was a kid, my father took me there to see the 1951 Festival of Britain. As we looked at the Skylon Tower, he said, "I think that's meant to be the future." Then, when I was 13, and my ward in St. Thomas's Hospital overlooked the river and Parliament. It's a very vivid memory. Also, as a student at Croydon College of Art, I used to change trains at Waterloo. There was a romantic element too. As a teenager, I used to walk along Waterloo Bridge with my girlfriend.
Terry meets Julie, Waterloo Station.
Though many assume the characters Terry and Julie are a reference to the Far From the Madding Crowd couple, Terence Stamp and Julie Christie, Davis had his sister and her husband emigrating to Australia in mind, the film being released 5 months after Waterloo Sunset. The Jam's Paul Weller has stated it's his favourite song ever, while Blur's Damon Albarn covered it with Davis himself in 1985.
don't feel afraid.
Not only that, but warring siblings Ray Davies and his guitarist brother Dave often coming to blows, were the prototype for the combustible Gallagher brothers. The Kinks weren't the only band in 1967 dreaming up very British characters and affixing them to 3 minutes of pop. On the aforementioned Penny Lane, Paul McCartney takes wistful snapshots of the Liverpool Road's residents, a barber, a fireman, a pretty nurse.
All the people that come and go, stop and say hello.
Small Faces' Itchy Park is the rare song that combines an acid trip with feeding the ducks.
To blow my mind, get on the decks with that bomb.
And Syd Barrett-led Pink Floyd's first single, Arnold Lane, concerns itself with washing lines and stolen underwear.
Moonshine washing line.
After the psychedelia of the late 60s came glam rock. It positioned rock stars as superhuman, sometimes alien beings, caked in makeup, wearing platform boots, and covered in glitter. It reverted back to the straightforward musicality of 50s rock and roll, where the 45 was king, but restructured with a postmodern twist, in a way that was new and theirs. It was pop music that knew it was pop music. T-Rex dominated the charts with bubblegum gibberish, because feel matters more than words.
Well, you'll be a napping call, you got a hubcap, diamond star halo.
While David Bowie self-reflexively wrote songs about 50s rock stars that squandered their potential.
He took it all too far, but boy, could he play guitar.
By 1972, Bowie was writing at such a rate he was able to give songs away. He'd previously lent Oh You Pretty Things to Herman Hermit's frontman, Peter Noone, prior to the release of Hunky Dory. Noone scoring a number 12 with it at a time when Bowie was still a one-hit wonder.
Let me say it again, you gotta make way for the Homo Superior.
Having read that London hipsters Mott the Hoople were breaking up, he offered them the then unreleased Suffragette City as a potential lifesaver. Only for them to reject it not being their style. 2 hours later, Bowie phoned back. He'd written something better. I literally wrote that within an hour or so of reading an article in one of the music rags that their breakup was imminent. I thought they were a fair little band, and I almost thought, this will be an interesting thing to do. Let's see if I can write this song and keep them together. It sounds terribly immodest now, but you go through that when you're young. How can I do everything by Friday? So I wrote this thing and thought, there, that should sort them out. Recorded with Bowie in the producer chair, Mott the Hoople released All the Young Dudes in July 1972 and charted at number 3, saving the band. Many see it as the uniting anthem of glam rock, a call to arms for all the outsiders. But that was never Bowie's intention. The song itself is a lost chapter of the Ziggy Stardust concept. The world plunged into resource-starved blackout. It is a call to the world's youth to spread the word that the end is coming in 5 years. Lyrically, it has a cast of characters like Ray Davies, but distorted, packed with the hopeless and damned.
The television man is crazy, Sam with juvenile delinquent Rex.
Street girls and drag queens scrambling for scraps, living for the moment.
When he's stealing clothes from Marks and Sparks, and Freddy's got spots from ripping up the stars.
The aching guitars and harmonies infused it with a quintessentially British melancholy. The organ giving the impression of an elegy, a requiem for what came before.
And my brother's back at home with his Beatles and his Stones.
The 60s is over. This is now.
We never got it off on that revolution stuff. What a drag.
Britpop would have similar feelings for what came immediately before. Itself an energetic, personable reaction to self-hating grunge and faceless shoegaze. And its ballads have a bit of All the Young Dudes to them. The weeping guitars and grandiose spoken word fade-out of Suede stay together. the sedated optimism of Blur's The Universal.
Yes, it really could happen.
And according to Noel Gallagher, it's half the basis for Don't Look Back in Anger. The key players of Britpop were kids during glam rock, all really young dudes and dudettes. But their chunky guitars were so elemental, they ended up being reflected 2 decades later. The riff of Bowie's Rebel Rebel ended up in the chorus melody of Supergrass's Pumping on Your Stereo. The introductory guitar blast of Elton John's spirited dive into glam rock, Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting, turns up in Pulp's Disco 2000. While T-Rex's Get It On and Oasis's Cigarettes and Alcohol open with a similar crunch. The explosion of UK punk brought about a lot of things. DIY ethos, the idea that anyone could be in a band, and a return to regional accents in British rock, whether that's Ian Dury's Estuary Bellow, or Buzzcock Pete Shelley's Lancashire Squawk. Sex Pistols' second single was not only about that typically British subject of the Queen, but gave us a key piece of cultural nihilism. Elsewhere for Britpop purposes, The Stranglers and Wire were a lawsuit-provoking sonic template for a couple of Elastica songs. While the epicenter of punk was London, a bunch of art school kids with an eye on fashion and paying lip service to anarchy. From the outskirts in Woking, the Jam took the honesty and momentum of the movement and fused it to their mod revivalism. Though they played gigs with the Clash and Pistols, they never really fit in. Teenagers dressed in mohair suits and skinny ties, who worshipped The Who. Bin singer Paul Weller's Surrey Bark, an interest in social realist novels. They had a clear air to Ray Davies and his detail-rich character studies.
They smelt of pubs and wormwood scrubs and too many right-wing meetings.
A huge part of the Jam's identity was their working-class upbringing. The fear that if they didn't make the band work, they'd end up in the factories. This meant they released music at a relentless clip. 5 albums between 1977 and 1980, often filled with examinations on the British class system. Though their debut single, In the City, had been a celebration of the capital and the punk movement. March 1979's Strangetown delved into their outsider status when in London, instantly seen as different by the way they talked.
You can't be read in a strange town. You'll be betrayed by your accent and manners.
Later that same year, they scored their first top 10 hit with the distorted churn of protest song, The Eton Rifles. Exploring the divide between the haves and have-nots. The title was taken from the top-hatted, moneyed schoolboys shooting club. I was watching the news on TV and I saw this footage of a Right to Work march going past Eton, where all the kids from the school came outside and started jeering at the marchers. I just thought what a great f***ing image it was. I didn't think of it as particularly political. It was released mere months after Margaret Thatcher had attained power, and characterised the power imbalance that would continue through 80s Britain. Weller also had time to take shots at the Clash. The dissonance of their Joe Strummer being the son of a British diplomat who wrote songs of revolution. Not that everyone sensed the venom. Former Eton schoolboy and Prime Minister David Cameron ranked it as one of his favourite ever songs, much to Weller's confusion. Weller would continue to depict the quiet desperation of the lower classes, with the bread and circuses strum of That's Entertainment.
Watching the telly and thinking about your holidays, that's entertainment.
And the Thatcher-scarred Motown of Town Called Malice. Come Britpop, Jarvis Cocker would pen perhaps the finest dissection of class asymmetry with common people. While the Battle of Britpop was as much about Oasis and Blur's respective backgrounds as the actual songs they released. And after Weller split the Jam in 1982 and spent the rest of his 80s in Style Council, he returned solo and stripped down on 1993's Wildwood and Stanley Road from 1995, coinciding with the first blush of Britpop, a prophet amongst his disciples.
I'm waiting for the change.
Weller even provides backing vocals and guitar solos on one of the movement's most grandiose statements, Oasis's Champagne Supernova. A recurring motif that runs through the descendants of Britpop is being well respected and commercially successful in their home country, but having limited actual hits stateside. Once the Kinks were allowed back in the country, they had Lola, and later Come Dancing.
Why not come dancing? It's only natural.
Bowie's glam era didn't appeal to the US, so he didn't chart top 40 until after he killed Ziggy. The Jam at best managed the lower reaches of the rock albums and top tracks chart with Town Called Malice. Part of the new wave, Squeeze from London, had a rock radio hit with Tempted in 1981.
Tempted by the fruit of another.
But in the UK, they made the Britpop mark a couple of years earlier with the gritty kitchen sink romance of Up the Junction.
I never thought it would happen with me and the girl from Clapham.
Important for many reasons for Pulp, Alaska and Blur, not least the ingenious move of rhyming telly with smelly twice.
We stayed in by the telly, although the room was smelly. No more nights by the telly, no more nights nappy smelly.
Their keyboardist, Jules Holland, would continue to be influential, hosting live music shows like Channel 4's The Tube and BBC's Often Britpop Showcase, later with Jules Holland, though scoring a college radio hit in 1987 with Dear God. XTC struggled for notice on either side of the Atlantic. If the Jam felt like outsiders coming from suburban Woking, as XTC were from Swindon, 2 hours from London, the best they could hope for was cult status. After a start creating angry, jerky power pop in the vein of Talking Heads or Wire, songwriter Andy Partridge soon abandoned that for savage satires centered on rural living. With boomier drums and slashier guitars, 1980's Black Sea was Partridge's attempt to prove he could besiege the singles chart. After their previous top 20 hit, the twitchy Making Plans for Nigel had been written and sung by bandmate and in his head rival Colin Moulding.
We're only making plans for Nigel.
Black Sea's fifth single, Respectable Street, was inspired by his first living situation after getting married.
We're neighbor slam his car door. Don't he realize this is respectable street?
His neighbour was not only an obsessive clean freak, earning her the nickname Mrs. Washing, but she couldn't abide the slightest bit of noise.
Bang the wall for me to turn down.
If we played any music, it doesn't matter what volume, and we couldn't play too loud because we didn't have a stereo set up. She'd be banging on the wall and yelling to turn down.
I can see them with their stern frown as they dispense the kind of look that says they're perfect.
Her and her husband and kids would have ferocious rows, where they were a lot louder than we were. It was this terrible hypocrisy. The street his home overlooked was incredibly middle class, their front gardens proudly displaying camper vans and caravans, status items to one-up their neighbours.
Breezing past the caravans that never move from their front gardens.
It's a song about the curtain twitchers, about the veneer of respectability,
Sunday church and they look fetching.
over a core of drunken vomit.
Saturday night saw him retching over our fence.
So English in its theming, Partridge affixed a Noel Coward tribute introduction, made to sound like a war-era 78.
It's in the way their curtains open and close.
Respectable Street never charted, after being banned from BBC Radio. At the time, Partridge had re-recorded the vocal to replace potentially offensive words, like abortion and contraception, with cleaned-up alternatives, to no avail.
Now they talk about abortions. Now they talk about absorption. As they speak of contraception. As they speak of child prevention.
It was years later that someone from the BBC informed him that the phrase that earned them the ban was Sony Entertainment Centre, as it was seen as advertising. Still, it didn't stop Blur from sourcing from the track at least twice during their Britpop peak.
Our fans. Tracy Chance.
They had hired Partridge to produce their second album, Modern Life is Rubbish, but after a few disastrous sessions, they returned to There's No Other Way producer, Stephen Street. Another early 80s song about one's housing situation that undeniably impacted Blur was 1982's Our House by Madness, a nostalgic ode to family and giving due respect to Mum.
Our mum, she's so house proud. Nothing ever slows her down and a mess is not allowed.
That has a cousin in the brass-driven Sunday Sunday. And I can't help but feel that the anarchic playground energy of baggy trousers can be heard in the childlike glee of Supergrass's I Should Coco. Though a new wave of British independent music was launched by punk, record stockists unaffiliated with the major labels like Stiff, Factory and Rough Trade, as well as self-funded releases like Buzzcocks' Spiral Scratch, indie music as a genre, as a sound, didn't exist. That was until Glasgow's Orange Juice. 1980's Blue Boy, released on the Tiny Postcard label, matched troppily strummed guitars, introspective Pete Shelley-learnt lyricism, and Edwyn Collins' heartfelt croon, and provided the template for 80s indie, and eventually Britpop. Though Orange Juice would gatecrash Top of the Pops with the TB303 splattered white funk of Rip It Up in 1983. It was the Smiths' appearance for This Charming Man in November that same year that pushed the indie sound beyond John Peel's radio show and to the British public at large. From Manchester but signed to London-based indie Rough Trade, The Smiths combined Morrissey's bookish camp wordplay with the tasteful rock guitar heroics of Johnny Marr. After first single Hand in Glove didn't chart, it was professional rivalry with label mates Aztec Camera that sparked their chart debut. A couple of days before I wrote This Charming Man, I'd heard Walk Out to Winter by Aztec Camera on BBC Radio 1.
Walk out to winter, swear I'll be there.
And I felt a little jealous. My competitive urges kicked in. I felt that we needed something upbeat and in a major key for Rough Trade to get behind. That's why I wrote it in the key of G, which to this day I rarely do. I knew that This Charming Man would be our next single. It was written for their second Peel session in September 1983, though at that point the heart-racing stops and starts and the very danceable, almost funk rhythm weren't quite in place.
I would go out tonight.
With Rough Trade financing their studio time for the single, Marr stacked 15 guitar tracks, acoustic as well as his Rickenbacker, to create this wondrous, shimmering jangle. Morrissey's lyrics were less a narrative, more a patchwork of imagery infused with a literary insight and ambiguous sexuality.
Man said it's gruesome that someone so handsome should care.
The opening stranded cyclist offered a lift by the titular Charming Man.
Bicycle on a hillside desolate.
Mixed up with quotes inspired by films, most notably from 1972's Michael Caine starring Sleuth.
A creeping, hairdressing seducer of silly women. A jumped-up pantry boy who doesn't know his place!
A jumped up country boy who never knew his place.
After the single got to number 25, the Top of the Pops performance made them stars.
This charming man.
Morrissey broadly gesturing with gladioli and an open shirt, a gesture both fey and forceful, movements and themes that Suede's Brett Anderson would adopt.
He knows so much about these things. He knows so much.
As their frontman emoted and sent flowers flying, his bandmates stood stock still in sweaters, miming to their indie disco party starter, giving the appearance of a gang you'd want to join. When Oasis released their first single, Supersonic, in April 1994, its cover was a group shot of the band, with Johnny Marr's Rickenbacker consciously laying in the background.
I need to be myself.
For a 16-year-old Noel Gallagher, no one was cooler. When the Smiths came on Top of the Pops for the first time, that was it for me. From that day on, I wouldn't say, yes, I probably would say, I wanted to be Johnny Marr. The La's are one of British indie's saddest could-have-been stories. Forming in Liverpool in 1983, guitarist-vocalist Lee Mathers joined the following year, eventually taking over completely. Mathers took all the best bits of the Beatles, Kinks and Stones, and crafted them into exquisite retro pop songs. Signed to indie label Go Discs, the band released a handful of singles from 1987 to 1989, the crown jewel being the circular, chiming love song, There She Goes. Whether about a girl or heroine, many still debate. But as close to a perfect pop song as it was, on its initial 1988 release, it didn't crack the UK Top 50, and Mathers was not happy with the version they released. He wanted the sound he heard in his head, something he'd managed to approach when recording demos, but unable to achieve in studio. What he was searching for was a classic 60s sound, a vibe and warmth that 80s recording technology was ill-equipped to replicate. Microphones were set up in trees and inside pianos, and original 60s mixing desks from Abbey Road were sourced to try and get it right. But never satisfied, Mathers drove his bandmates to distraction. Lee was dictating things to people that they couldn't understand or do. But the problems were internal cranium than external physical. Whenever there was a problem, Lee thought that getting a different drummer or guitarist would cure it. He was always wanting a fresh start. In his quest for that elusive analog 60s quality, this pure retroism, Mathers went through 8 producers, 9 studios, and at least 7 bandmates, taking 3 years and numerous sessions to get the album sounding just so. In the end, he never got there. His label snatched his record out from under him and released it as the band's self-titled album in October 1990, in an attempt to recoup some of the studio costs. Though it got great reviews, the La's broke up soon after. Noel Gallagher in an early interview stated that Oasis would be the band to finish what the La's started, and with their backward-looking perfect pop attitude to songcraft becoming the biggest thing in British music, they kinda did. And many others, including Dodgy, the Bluetones, and Cast, the next band from La's bassist John Powers, took on their no-nonsense approach to jangly Britpop, grabbing the success that the La's never achieved. The La's weren't the only late 80s indie group looking to Britain's past for the basis for their tunes. Early Stone Roses singles lent heavily on the psychedelic quality of the Rolling Stones and Beatles. By the release of the indie dancefloor classic Fool's Gold in December 1989, Stone Roses was such a big deal, it charted at number 8. Though on Top of the Pops a fair few times, the best the Smiths ever did when they were together was a couple of number 10 placings. Indie was slowly reckoning with the top end of the UK charts. When fellow Manchester band James first put out Sit Down in June 1989, it went to number 77. But after a reworking 2 years later, they were held off the top spot for 3 weeks by only Chesney Hawkes. As their label went bust, the Sunday's sweet indie pop confection, Here's Where the Story Ends, from 1990's Reading, Writing in Arithmetic, was never a single in the UK, so never charted.
It's that little souvenir of a terrible year.
But in the US, it was a modern rock airplay number 1. Indie was becoming pop. In 1992, no one knew what was about to hit them. Grunge ruled the roost on the other side of the Atlantic. The last gasps of Manchester and shoegaze, holding the attention of the UK music press. Suede were different. So different that they struggled to get signed, not being the new version of Ride that everyone in the UK was seeking, though an early lineup featured future Elastica singer Justine Frischmann on bass. It was when she left and teen guitar wunderkind Bernard Butler took over songwriting that things started to slot into place. The Drowners was from the first batch of stuff we did that sounded fully formed, and not like we had been doing before at all. It had weird edges to it that the other stuff we had written didn't. The stuff we'd been doing before was Smithsier, but The Drowners doesn't jangle at all. With its martial drums and lurching guitar peals, May 1992's The Drowners was a return to the glam of Bowie and T-Rex, joined with a flirtatious nudge wink. Singer Brett Anderson's wails and use of gendered pronouns suggested way more than Bowie clutching Mick Ronson to his side, or Morrissey's charming man. The Drowners of the title were a cult of Suede's own devising, kicking back against consumerism, similarly fringed wastrels outfitted in jumble sale chic. The wild ones, the beautiful ones, wandering about roundabouts, making out on gravestones, and being too androgynously beautiful to join the rat race. Their third single, February 1983's Animal Nitrate, was even more filthy and debauched. But before any of these singles had even been released, at the end of April 1982, Suede were on the cover of Melody Maker under the headline, "The Best New Band in Britain." It was standard practice British music press hype, writer Steve Sutherland fabricating hotness out of pure whim, but followed by a clutch of sold-out shows and the Drowners, Metal Mickey and Animal Nitrate, wowing the indie set with their mix of sex and love and jealousy. They earned that excitement. When they shimmied and shook their way through the latter at the 1983 Brit Awards the week before its release, announced as the already legendary Suede, they had become undeniable. Then in April 1983, a year after that Melody Maker cover, Anderson appeared on the front of Select with the Union flag superimposed behind him. The threat, "Yanks go home," across his chest. Though it didn't yet have a name, Britpop had begun. "1994's Parklife was not Blur's first rodeo. They'd emerged chasing the coattails of Manchester, their uneven debut Leisure in 1991, grabbing them their first UK top 10 hit with the loping There's No Other Way.
There's no other way, there's no other way.
But like Bowie after Space Oddity, no one expected much else from them. Grueling tours of the US instilled a hatred of American culture, especially its dour grunge that clogged the airwaves. Their second album, May 1983's Modern Life is Rubbish, was the result. Drawing deep from a well of their home nation's pop, The Kinks, The Jam, and XTC, its wind-swept lead single, For Tomorrow, a Waterloo sunset for the 90s. But none of its 3 singles got beyond number 26. It was an album 11 months too soon. Coming into March 1984, Blur surprised even themselves with Girls and Boys. Built on a synth-pop skeleton, rinky-dink drum machine, and Alex James' Duran Duran bass line, punctuated with the post-punk guitar stabs of Graham Coxon. It was satire in form as well as content, the kind of syncopated dance pop that populated clubs on Mediterranean 18 to 30 holidays.
Girls who are boys, who like boys, who be girls, who do boys like their girls.
Furthered when the Pet Shop Boys remix of the track became a club hit across Europe. It had been inspired by frontman Damon Albarn's trip to Magaluf with Justin Frischmann the previous summer, the Spanish island bowing to their rowdy, lustful British patrons. The place was just equally divided between cafes serving up full English breakfasts and really tacky Essex nightclubs. There's a very strong sexuality about it. I just love the whole idea of it, to be honest. I love herds.
Following the herd down to Greece.
All these blokes and all these girls meeting at the watering hole and just copulating. There's no morality involved. I'm not saying it should or shouldn't happen. This irresistible glob of indie disco was their biggest hit yet, reaching number 5, surpassing any single the Smiths ever put out. Thanks to further singles, Parklife, End of a Century, and To the End, his parent album ended up peaking at number 1 and going twice platinum by the end of the year. Blur were now an extremely big deal for an indie group, an ascent that was unlikely but not impossible to be undone by a class war. The music press adage is that 3 bands make a scene. By March 1994, Suede had cemented themselves as new and exciting. Justin Frischmann's Elastica had released debut single Stutter late in 1993. and Blur were ready for round 3. Initially, some attempts were made to dub these bands as the new wave of new wave, but soon after Girls and Boys had smashed the top 5, Cliff Jones had theorised in a Blur feature in Star magazine, The Face. If punk was the last peculiarly English revolt into style, its legacy was a re-empowering of Brit pop. Before long, every British indie guitar band was being tagged with the term. Even Larry rock and roll Mancunians, Oasis. Like many cultural movements, no one was particularly thrilled to be lumped in with Britpop. It was a moment where British music with British values was dominating radio, the Union flag littering the landscape, whether on magazine covers, guitars, or miniskirts. And as heard before as the music was, this love for one's country's culture and a rejection of others gave off the rancid scent of nationalism. It didn't help that most of the key players were very white and male. Those that were making music in Britain at the time that weren't part of it hated it. If 1994 was the year Britpop broke, 1995 was its peak, the year where Britpop battled. Pulp last-minute headlined Glastonbury, and Alaska briefly held the title for fastest-selling debut album of all time. But only 2 years later, in 1997, all enthusiasm for this moment had faded. Oasis's Be Here Now was the epitome of the genre's bloat and self-indulgence. Blur had decided that maybe US influences weren't such a bad thing, and Radiohead's OK Computer showed that there was another way. From start to finish, it lasted 3 years tops, an odd point in time where Britannia was deemed cool, but with surprisingly little footprint influence-wise. Perhaps the enemy-backed British boys with guitars, the Libertines and Arctic Monkeys, and the ensuing landfill indie era could be marked as an attempt at Britpop 2.
You know I cherish you, my love. Oh, I cherish you, my love. I bet that you look good on the dance floor. I don't know if you're looking for romance or well, just come back to me. Come back to me. I put it to riot. I put it to riot. What happens when you lose? You just started 22 grand job.
However, the songs remain. Everyone with an acoustic guitar knows Wonderwall. Park Life is still shouted along to at football matches. And someone is always going to attempt all 6 minutes of Common People at karaoke. And because of that, Britpop will live forever. Thanks for watching. Which other songs do you think should be blamed for Britpop? If you like this video, like, subscribe, and why don't you share it with a couple of people? It really does help. As always, I'd like to shout out this month's new top tier supporters over on Patreon, Thomas Griffiths and Kater O. Erskine. And thanks to everyone else that supports me. See you next year.